So, hello and welcome, everyone. This is the second installment of our Six Sigma Summer Series. That's a lot of S's. We have Bob Szeimies with us today to talk about quality and what that really means. So, thank you for joining us. We do this happy hour virtually every first Tuesday. That next first Tuesday, we're going to continue our Six Sigma Summer series with a Grill the Guru panel. We did this last quarter with root cause analysis. Our gurus are still TBD or TBA, but this will be the Tuesday right after Labor Day. So I hope you can join us then. So we at Lean Portland are a group of Lean and Six Sigma people who want to share our work in the community. And that means our methods, resources, results, stories, so that we can all learn from each other. And there's a couple ways listed here that you can get in touch with us. I think the easiest way is to follow us on Eventbrite, and then you'll get a notification every time we add a new event. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Bob. Welcome, Bob.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, and Bob, I should have asked, I know you have a couple of discussion questions worked into your presentation here. So we welcome discussion and comments as we go.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There should be multiple times where you guys maybe even disagree. So bring it on.
Awesome.
Bring it on. That'll be make it more interesting. Okay, you see the screen okay?
Yeah, looks good on our side.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple notes about this topic. It's kind of around quality, but it's also a little bit deeper dive, and it's called reduction of variability around target. We'll see if any of you have already been around this, have experience with it, but I had quite a bit of experience with this whole thing in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, in that time frame. I spent a lot of time in this subject matter. And along those lines, this is only like the tip of the iceberg as far as going further with this, with things like you guys talked about process control last time, I think. Gauge R&R, process control, hypothesis testing, experimentation, design experiments, full factorials, fractional factorials, sample size calculations, alpha, beta, type 1, type 2 error. What did all those things really mean? I learned them in college, but they didn't mean anything to me at the time. But I spent a lot of time with them, and they actually have really cool meanings if you haven't got into that pretty deep yourself. Like in college, it's like type 1 error. Oh, that's producer risk. Well, what does that really even mean? They actually have really important meanings when you're doing experimentation and inferential statistics. So there's a bazillion more topics that if you guys are interested, that I've been in a lot, that we'd get into. Not tonight, but just throw that out there. I mean, it's pretty fun stuff, I think. And some of you might think that too. Yeah, so another thing about Six Sigma, we were talking about this just a couple minutes ago. I have seen a company or two put a bunch of training into Six Sigma and then not do a whole lot with it. I don't know if you guys have experienced that at all. But part of, 2 thumbs up from Maria, a little bit more. Part of that, why that happens, I believe, is why did we do that? And if we did that to get some more tools in our toolbox, great. Okay, it's good knowledge. But hopefully you would have some kind of thing you're going after in your company that fits into. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. Okay, because I'm going to give you one, toward the end of this discussion, you'll have one opportunity to do a bunch of work related to Six Sigma. Okay, we good? All right, so here is some of the things I notice. So this was on my favorite news website the other day in the green box there. There's an article, Starbucks admitting hot coffee lids are falling off. Burning customers. Jury awards a woman $100,000. Okay. There's a lot of other examples I find too, but this one is kind of interesting. It's like very, Starbucks in the news, very commonplace. Everybody knows about Starbucks. My question about this is what's going on here? What the lids are falling off, and if you read the article, the employees actually talk about it a little bit. Like, yeah, well, it's not all of them. Some of them do, yeah, but some of them work pretty good. And you read a little bit deeper, and you can only get so much out of it. If you were to go in and really probe in this, you'd get some better information. But there's some it's inferred that the suppliers of the lids and the cups are kind of saying, well, it's not us. We're making them in spec. I don't know if you guys have ever been in manufacturing and around this kind of a thing, but this is not unusual at all. Something's not working right. Everybody claims, we're good. We measured them, they're fine. We measured them, didn't get exactly the same rating because of gauging variability. That's a whole nother great subject to cover. But hopefully you can imagine that this has something to do with, there's variability in the cup manufacturers and as well as the lid. The lids come from somewhere, Lithuania, probably. And the cups have got to come from Czechoslovakia. That might be a stretch. Two different suppliers, but they're all saying, we're good. They're in spec. What's the deal? But you can imagine, hopefully, that you're getting this situation where maybe the cup is on the small side, but in spec, and the lid's in spec, but on the high side, and it doesn't fit too snugly. It kind of doesn't have as much holding power, so it falls off occasionally. Makes sense?
What's the spec variability?
Yeah, and it's plus or minus 10th hour, whatever it is, right? And everybody's, okay, you're meeting it, but so it is kind of a spec, stack up situation. It is a bit of that, right? But this is not unusual, and often these kind of arguments take place, but they never really get resolved. It comes back around again later. Okay, and just keeps happening over and over, and everybody's still claiming. So, Neil, I don't know if you meant to do that, but sometimes somebody will just throw in, well, just narrow the specs, get over it, right? Well, what does that do? Usually, if you say, well, I want you to make them now, but instead of plus or minus 10th hour, I want you to make them within plus or minus 5th hour.
You're getting space grade quality coffee cups.
You say, okay,
Super
double
expensive.
double the price, double the cost,
Yeah.
right? And that's a paradigm that I hope we can break coming up here in this discussion. Okay. But that is a normal reaction, and that's often, well, they fight with purchasing and nobody wants to pay more, so it gets stuck. Okay, this is not and again, it's a coffee cup example, but it's not an unusual situation. Okay,
Happens all the time.
it does. So there's opportunity here with these kind of things. And before we dive in deeper on this, I want to back up just a little bit. And I already used the word quality. So what kind of definitions of quality do you guys have bouncing around out there? I mean, there's one that says meeting or exceeding customer needs and expectations is kind of a common-ish one. You guys have any others that you've been trained on, or that you've kind of got on your own, or your company is doing right now? Do you have a definition? Anyone?
Mine isn't. It was a metric that we used.
Oh,
And that became a little bit of like what we defined it as, like first pass yield. Doing it right the first time.
oh, the famous doing it right the first time. Love it. And I say that facetiously in a sec here. But first pass yield, that's a great metric. Okay, so that's do it right the first time. Matter of fact, a company that I've been around a lot lately does that a lot. They're like, come on, quality is really super important, focus, but not providing really any tools or anything. Just do it right the first time, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that gets us nothing to speak of. yeah, everybody's interested in it, but there's no tools to speak of. Anyway, so there's a few definitions of quality out there. And conformance to spec was one I was taught. That's what quality is. Okay, and as a matter of fact, not to throw any particular companies under the bus, but here's one that I saw just the other day. Right? The definition of quality is conformance to requirements.
Classic.
The system of quality is prevention. I like the thought there. The performance standard is 0 defects. Okay. The measurement is the cost of non-conformance, like out of spec, scrap kind of stuff, maybe field problems. Okay. And the purpose is to create customer success. So I think there's some good thoughts in there. But there's multiple holes in there for me. That's part of the discussion here. Conformance to requirements hurts me badly in reading that one, and I'll explain why that is. You can read that as, I think you can read that as conformance to spec. That's one of the requirements. There's other regulatory things. But so for me, I think of it more like this way. So like quality, you got to have a good design to start with, right? That's a starting point. You can't have a lousy design, even if you do it consistently. That's not great, right? You got to have a good design that meets customer requirements. And there's a whole field of quality function deployment, quality tables, and all this stuff to make sure you're meeting customer needs. You want to have that. It looks good. It feels good. That's great. Meets it maybe even exceeds, maybe a little customer delight in there. Good value, even though it's expensive, it's worth it. Or it's this medium value proposition. That can be a medium product in that way, as long as the price is right. That's really kind of bordering on, that's pretty high quality too. You guys okay with that so far? Robust design is a whole nother topic that goes into this Lean Sigma stuff too, but that's for another day. But so you got let's say we got a good design. Like, hey, I like that. I like how this car is designed. I like how the Big Mac is designed. That's part of it. We'll get back to the Big Mac in a sec. So first thing, got to have a decent/good design. Next thing is quality that's related to quality is more around execution. It has to do with visual and functional defects. If you're sending me defects, like let's say clearly, like did not work, missing part, super big scratch in it, it's like you can't even, quality is not really even in the conversation anymore. And to me, this is like a 50-year-old thing. Like that was one of the things back in the 80s, like, well, I'll send a lot of defects. And we worked on that quite a bit, but kind of like anything, we're still not all that great at it. It's kind of interesting how not great we still are, but it's better, but still a lot of opportunity. So great design, do not send me defects, right? That's kind of like a must-have anymore, I think. You guys agree? So you can't really even get into the quality detailed conversation until you're not sending defects. Where I work, we're still sending out, we send out a really high volume of stuff. So percentage-wise, it's not as high, but we send out product with missing parts still fairly regularly, right? And those customers get really unhappy when they said, I spent 25 grand on this. I got a building. I got to start my practice. I'm putting it in and it doesn't work because you shorted me 3 parts. It doesn't go over very well, right? So there's great design. Part of the execution is this: do not send clear defects. Okay. Now, instead of saying do it right the first time and all that stuff, we still want to do that. Do it right the first time, first pass yield. We want to have good tools for the team members, right? How are we going to do this? We're going to try to put in poke-yoke so this doesn't happen. We're going to try to get to the root cause of these things so it doesn't happen. Quite often, a company will just say, come on, focus, right? And not give tools. That's the only one that turns me on negative in that one. But so we got a good design. we now execute well enough that we don't send too many defects. Okay, it's really low now. Good job. Is that mostly it? Are we there in terms of quality? Great design or good design, and we're not sending you clear defects. Or is there a little more to the story? Is that mostly it as far as quality? Not sending defects. So we're meeting specs, we're meeting requirements.
I was going to say, what about how long you're able to do it? Because in your coffee cup example, you could have had a great design and you could have not sent defects for the first year, but then whenever year 2 starts, you may start to send defects. So maybe like with the tolerance piece that you mentioned, or something a little bit over, like delivery over time, like being consistent.
Okay. Consistency. Okay, thank you. That is in a slide or two here. That's going to be one of the most key words we've got. Is that consistency is a huge key to quality, right? Great design, but you got to consistently, absolutely to your point, you got to send them no defects consistently. Okay. And then we're going to dive in a little bit further on that whole consistency thought. Thanks for bringing it up, because there's a little bit more to this story that a lot of companies I find miss. So let's move in a little closer yet. Okay. So good design. We're not sending any ugly stuff to you. All the parts are there. It's great. Now we use the parts, the product, whatever it is. What about the dimensional quality, the measurable attributes on the parts? Is the quality of those, just make sure they're in spec?
No, that can't be all of it.
That can't be all of it. The majority or most companies, that's it. I mean, if we're got a good design and we're not chipping you junk very often, and we're meeting specs on these key characteristics, attributes, life's pretty good. Neil, say more about there's got to be more to it.
Well, there's the attitude of how we manufacture it and achieve that consistency and conformance to spec is important, because that's what gets us to the ability to deliver consistently. If we don't have a good attitude, a good culture, we aren't going to have the consistent conformance and ability to deliver. We're not going to check our machinery. We're not going to check our performance on a regular basis and ensure that we're not sending defective material. We're going to expect the customer to check it when they receive it. We're going to do things like that are not proactive and not building quality into our processes.
Okay, I don't disagree. I'm going to go even further than that. Go ahead, Maria.
Neil, I like how you're bringing in like the behavior piece of it. Like, are we checking it? And I'm also I don't know, this doesn't answer the question at all, but I'm thinking about so many organizations that I'm familiar with. As long as it's good or bad, we're like, quality is okay, so let's move on to the next fire. And there's this like switching to like, that's not a problem, therefore we should put our continuous improvement resources on a different problem, and then we end up chasing problems around.
That's thrown in there too. Absolutely. So yes, all the above. Good inputs there. But yeah, it becomes the vicious circle still. Okay, so let's go in a little closer. Yeah, let's say we are the assemblers. We're not putting a lid and a cup together necessarily. Maybe we're putting together parts, a shaft and a bushing, an assembly, putting a plastic thing on it, whatever product you can think of that you're assembling. And if I'm working at assembly, what do quality incoming parts mean to me? They said, hey, are your, you machine them up there and you paint them over there, and then they send them to you. And these guys over here do this part and they send them to you. And you're getting all these different parts and you're assembling them. If you're doing that assembly, what is incoming high quality part mean to me if I'm that assembler? What do I want?
My initial thought is if I'm like putting things together and I'm grabbing from the parts pile, that I can follow the instructions that I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I can
if something doesn't clearly fit, then I can't do it. But if I can do it, then I'm okay.
Okay. So clearly fit. So you want parts that fit consistently?
Yes.
If I'm asking you, so let's say you're putting together a shaft and a bushing, and it matters to performance in the field. If it's super tight, it's not going to work perfectly. If it's just the right amount, it's going to work pretty good. If it's too loose, it's still going to work, but the customer might think it's kind of loose. So what is it that you want?
Can I say something, Maria? Or were you gonna? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If this were me, it's a combination of the 5S. Like I want those parts delivered, labeled clearly in the same place so that I know where to grab them. And I know that I'm not grabbing another shaft that kind of looks like it.
Okay.
So I know that I'm building the right parts, but then I need validation when I build it to know that it's good before I pass it off to the next person. Some sort of like visual check, something that I write down to say, I just built this part. And not just because I put it together is it good. Something else validated that like it is actually good. It meets, it's ready to go to the next bucket of work.
Okay. And if I told you, yes, and here's how you validate it, you put them together and you check that fit. If it's too tight, it's going to overheat. It's not going to work right. If it's too loose, it's going to feel kind of cheap to the customer. Here's about right. So if you were supposed to make parts that are just about right, make an assembly that's just about right, what are you going to ask for in the parts coming to you? Dimensionally.
I don't think we're going to guess this one.
I'd say that they're all just about right.
Just about right. And Dominic, you mentioned that. You want it consistent.
Yeah, but are you guys kind of leaning towards like somewhere in the middle of that dimension, like whatever that ideal dimension is, something that doesn't like move too far from where that ideal position is supposed to be. So if the gap is supposed to be X, I want X.
Isn't that what you would want as an assembler?
I would.
That makes sense? Or are you going to say, just make them in spec anywhere?
No, because anywhere leads to that stack up that we were talking about. One's too big, one's too small. And then you're doing your job, but you're not producing the best thing for the next person.
Right. And even it gets, sometimes even we think we're kind of meeting the specs, but they don't even go together sometimes. And other times they're loose, clearly loose. Okay. So you get that. If you have somebody assembling for a while, what they'll tell you is that kind of stuff you guys are talking about. Yeah, make them like consistent. Consistently good, consistently right, so that they all fit together easily. They go together easily, meeting all those things you asked for, Dominic. I got the right parts, and they fit together right. If they don't fit together right, it causes inefficiencies in the process, and the customer's not getting as high quality as they could be. Okay. Same thing if you buy a part over and over, you are often judging it on the consistency of it. Even the Big Mac I brought up. If you like the design of a Big Mac, good news for you. You can go to any McDonald's and get a really consistent Big Mac for the most part. You don't like the design, then that's a different quality issue, right? But they strive to be as consistent as possible. They have they put a lot into that through the years. I don't know how they are now exactly, but there are some studies done on that, how consistent they were across. So you get that McDouble or whatever, you can be assured it's going to be really similar. Same thing with restaurants. If you think about it, I went into that restaurant, I loved it. It was like a 9. So you went back again a month later. Pretty good, an 8, right? Went back a couple months later with a friend. It was like a 4 that time, though. It just wasn't quite as good. The surface wasn't good as good. The food wasn't quite as good. So are you going to go back there? Don't know, right? It was a 9, then an 8, then a 4.
Not likely to return.
Not likely to return, right? And then across like cars or something, it's not you're buying one over and over, but you're hearing about other people buy them and you're hearing what they're saying. Because if you get a bad, if you have a bad experience, the car was not great, you tell like 7 people. And if it's good, you tell like 1 or 2 people, right? So that adds up to, so consistency is something super key to, we're not talking necessarily in terms of defects. We're talking about all those dimensional things that we're creating all the time. Consistency is a real key to quality. Everybody okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
Not arguing? Okay. So can we agree dimensional quality actually has more to do with consistency than it does with meeting specs? Like your customers will not say, just send me anything in spec. That's not what they'll say. They don't even know what your specs are. They'll say, give me parts that fit together right, consistently. Right?
It seems to me like we're just using different words to make the same point, though.
Okay.
Like if they fit together too tight, then how can they A be in spec and B not fit?
Say that
then
again.
The spec, I do not understand.
Yep.
How you can give me a shaft and a bushing
Mm-hmm.
that are quote in spec unquote, and sometimes they fit well and sometimes they don't fit well. That sounds like the spec is wrong to me,
Okay.
or else I don't understand what a spec is.
No. So if you have a spec, and it depends on how they're specified, but it's very normal to have, if you do have a spec like that, a shaft and a bushing, if you have a part just at the very high end for the shaft and at the very low end for the bushing and put them together, they'll be pretty tight, depending on how they're specified. Because, the tighter the spec, the more cost, generally speaking, although I'm going to throw water on that here coming up also shortly. You can have parts all in spec and they still work, but they're not great. They're not really high quality. It's a tight fit, or the other way around, small shaft, large hole. They work and we say they're in spec and they're acceptable, but we're not really after like acceptable. I mean, that's not high quality. It'll function. Some customers, they're not going to necessarily complain about it, but it's like going to the restaurant and being a 7 or 6. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either.
It's the reason there is differences in how long engines last. Because if the parts all fit together at just the right gaps,
mm-hmm.
then you don't have the high wear between them that you do if you have them just a little too loose or just a little too tight.
Right. 3 thou gap is perfect. It'll wear, you get the lubrication in there. A 5 thou gap is kind of sloppy, it'll wear out. 1 thou is actually too tight. You don't get enough lubrication in there. And again, the tendency is we want to, well, then let's spec it tighter. But what you do, if you do that, you artificially create more expense immediately. As a matter of fact, in our factory, if we said, let's just cut all the specs in half, we'd like go out of business because we're going to be sorting everything, right? There's a different way, and that's what I'll show you here in just a sec. So keep the questions coming. Hopefully it'll make more sense here as we go. So let's go to a process. Here at the Gemba, I'm making parts. I'm making those shafts or the bushings. Okay, here's my lower spec. There's my upper spec. And the typical mentality, if you will, or standards or the culture of this process is, I want you to make production efficiently, and you need to make 50 an hour, whatever the number is, and make them in spec. That's good. We're trying not to make any out of spec. In spec good, out of spec bad. Okay, that's the typical way processes are run. I don't know about typical, but the majority, let's say. Okay, so what happens is you indeed get parts throughout the spec. You get some high ones, you get some low ones. That's allowed. I mean, that's what we're doing. And in spec good, out of spec bad. Before I go a little further on that, I want to point out one little thing to think about. If that's our mentality, in spec good, out of spec bad, you see the part where I got the arrow pointing to good with the question mark? You see that part is like, oof, right there on that spec, right? Yeah, it's in, right? Yeah, we're good, right?
Yeah, the center of the X is good, but part of it's out. So.
Oh, right. And this isn't even appropriate because gauging variability is wider than that X is. But that's again another story. So assuming we have an incredible gauge, ooh, that baby is right there. But by golly, it's in, so it is good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the red X? What about that part? It's like a tiny bit away from the other one, and we're saying, oh, that one's no good. Absolutely not.
But that one's no good because the center is to the left of lower spec.
Yeah, right. It's just barely, and we measured it and we got a great gauge. And by golly, it is just infinitesimally small, but it is out of spec. Interesting to me that we make these judgments and we spend so much time on this. I don't know if you guys are. So what we usually do is we get somebody else to measure it and hope they'll measure it and it'll be okay, right? That whole game.
Mhm.
Right? Yeah. But in reality, if this gauge variability is tiny, tell me is the difference between those two parts? I mean, in practical purposes, what's the difference between them?
Not as much as the other X's that are further apart on that entire spectrum over there.
Mhm.
Absolutely. There's like virtually no difference in those two parts.
Yeah.
And yet we spend lots of time and energy trying to sort those out because we believe that's a cliff, that spec is, and by golly, that one will work good and that one won't. Truth is, as we get to this, you'll find both of those are not good.
Mm-hmm.
Not very good. They're not high quality. There's very little difference between them, yet we pretend there is. And you do have to make the call. You do have to have a spec that says, look, that's so far out there that we can't use it. You do have to make that call. I'm not saying you don't. But it's interesting how much energy we put into that when we could be putting our energy into something else, like actually making the process better.
I think we do that with a lot of things, right? Is say, well, we have to put a line somewhere. So let's put the line here. And we have a lot of deliberation around where the line goes. And if we're in or outside of the line, and I think, I'm seeing the flaws in this thinking.
Yes. Okay, let's continue on. So if your mentality is that in spec good, out of spec bad, this is what you'll actually produce through time because you're allowing people to run them. And, on swing shift, we like to run a little higher. On day shift, we like to run a little lower. Over here, this guy likes to run that. So you can put all kinds of distributions you want in there. I just put X's for now. Say what you get is parts throughout the spec, and they'll spill out both sides as much as we don't want to admit it. They do. Right? You don't measure them all unless you have a real slow process, and even then gauge variability again. So this is what you are doing. You're spraying parts throughout the spec and thinking we are high quality. And if this is an important characteristic, I didn't mention that. I said we're talking about dimensions here that matter. We're not talking about reference dimensions and all these, right? This matters. This shaft fits with this bushing. This matters to the customer. So in the red there, if this is how I'm doing it, this is how I'm running my process, do you think your downstream customers consider you a high quality supplier?
No.
I'm after the answer is no. Now, conceptually, again, if you had a super tight spec, yeah, maybe they don't notice the variation. But in most cases, that's not how it is. It is, yeah, you can tell a difference in parts throughout the spec. The high ones act a little bit different than the low ones. And I'm getting these high ones. So now I get this, my lid supplier and my cup supplier are both doing this. So I get this mix and match. And when I get the high cup or the high diameter lid and the small diameter cup, it doesn't stay on very well. And so people get burned. Okay. So this, again, this is very not unusual at all, but it's not a great thing. Okay. It's not a great approach. Again, partly because of this, we spend so much time arguing about those parts, but there's a lot more to this. So what's missing? I've kind of led, but you guys are coming up with these things also, which is good. You guys are talking about consistency. We want consistency. I want them this way all the time. And yet here I am upstream. I'm not sending you that. So what should I be doing different at this upstream process? What's missing? Thoughts? What should I be doing different?
One of the things that stands out to me is really, what is the team defining as in spec or quality? So, if those are not the right goalposts, I think the team should always have alignment on what the definitions of those are and how we came to those. And so, for me, as I'm listening to this, that's one of the things I'm thinking about is how did we get to that point?
So
and then regardless of what we call it, how do we bring in the goalposts to what they should be?
Okay. Good thought. I go to my design engineer team who swears up and down those are perfectly valid specs. And it would be great if we had perfectly valid specs. We've done designed experiments and tried all these parts and all these different combinations, and no, it's not really the case. That's a good question. Oftentimes specs aren't necessarily appropriate. They should be tweaked a little bit, but let's say these specs they're reasonable. So again, our downstream customers are saying, I want them consistent. And here I am blasting away, making the parts, get some high ones some days, some low ones the other day. What could I do different? So I validated the spec. We're on, those are right. Thoughts?
I might be taking us down a rabbit hole here, so reel me back in if needed. I'm remembering our last month happy hour with Brian Hurley around the control charts. And he made one comment, and I'm glad we recorded that one and this one because it will be interesting to go back. And he made one. I remember him saying at one point, these control limits are different than the spec limits. And I think my eyes, though, don't always remember. Like, it's a great reminder because my eyes don't remember that. The charts look very similar, right? There's a bunch of data points. There's two lines on the side, but they're different things.
Yeah. That's absolutely 100% correct what you and he said. Control limits are completely different than spec limits. Control limits come from the natural variability in your process, which could care less about what your specs are. It's got built-in variability, comes from that. You're also usually, those x's are usually x bars. You're usually a sample of 5 or 10 or something. So you're plotting averages, not individual parts, but that's a whole nother discussion. So what I'm fishing for here is this mentality in spec good, out of spec bad has been going on for decades. What's missing? And the first step is to think about this. Is there not an optimal place within there somewhere? Like that, like we talked about, Neil, I think you brought up the perfect difference between the shaft and the bushing is 3 thou or 5, whatever it is. There is an optimal place. On most key characteristics, there is an optimal place. Hardness 52 HRC is the ideal spot because it's hard enough to resist breaking and it wears a long time, but it's not too brittle. 54, boy, it wears great, but it's brittle and it breaks sometimes. 52, 50, it wears out pretty quick. So 52 is the great place for hardness. This diameter, 2 inches right on the mating bushing should be 2.003. Those are the perfect places. If we could make them there, that's where we want to make them. Interesting, this mentality is often very missing. Like we're just got spec goalpost mentality. In there is anywhere is good. But in reality, in most key characteristics, if they are key, there is an optimum place. That make sense so far?
Yeah, what is it that keeps us from communicating the target or the optimum spot to the customer or to the manufacturer. Our
It's-
target optimum spot for this spec is 3000s.
Isn't it crazy? I mean, you'll find it on the part prints often. Some designers don't think about it, unfortunately. But it goes back to the poster, conformance to spec. So that's what we're after. So why do I care?
Mhm.
And it's such a miss. It's such a costly miss. And we'll get to that even more. So yeah, there's a lot of things in the way, but there's nothing technologically in the way of creating targets. I mean, even if it's not the perfect place, even if it's in the ballpark, it's kind of in there somewhere, it's better than shooting for spec in a lot of different ways. Okay, follow me? All right, so let's change our mindset. There is a best place to make these parts. And how about let's try to make more of them around the target. Just that shift from goalposts to, hey, let's try to make them the same is a huge paradigm shift. And I'll caution people thinking about, well, just change specs. Again, that's a route. That's like, to me, like in lean, take out all the inventory. It'll show you all your problems. Well, it will, and you'll never get anything out the door for a while. It's a really painful way to go. So here, narrowing the specs is also a painful way to go. You can do it, but you're going to almost shut your factory down immediately is what's going to happen. And your costs are going to go up for a while. A better approach is to say, we know that's the target. Let's, through time, figure out how to run this process to make more and more parts on target and figure out how to do that, because we've never tried that. We've been trying to just put them in there somewhere. How about we figure out how to keep it there, reduce the variability through time, and make them more and more and more consistent. And
so you're saying that that's better, but how do we know that that's better?
how do we know what's better?
You know, you said that the target, taking the target approach is a superior approach. And it's a great assertion, and I'm not saying that you're wrong, but I'm wondering how you know you're right.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll talk about the exact benefits of doing all this, you know, as we get through it. So go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Bob, that like in that last slide, I think one of the things that you're kind of doing here is you're anchoring the team around a different vision of success.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So as all the things that we're thinking about each day that we move forward with the project aren't so much how do we keep things between the goalposts, but how do we get things closer to the target? And
right.
I think that just that like change in vision is that mindset shift that I think you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Just kind of, I guess, reiterating what you're saying in my thinking.
Spot on, because again, we'll talk about all the benefits of doing this, but that's where the rubber meets the road right there, is that thought about, let's not just shoot for spec anywhere and miss all the time and do all this stuff. Let's instead, again, through time, because most of the time you can't just do this. You got to learn how to do it. But start producing more, because that's what everybody wants. Yeah. That's what everybody wants. All our customers want that. They don't want all throughout the spec. They want them the same.
If I were the upstream process in this, and somebody told me to make it to a target, that would also give me more direction. And more purpose as I was building.
Absolutely. So when you start, we were there, and after a couple months, we figured out a couple things using maybe process control charts. Oh, we have this. Whenever we do that, whenever we do this changeover, and we put it back, now all the parts are on the low side. Well, let's figure out how to do that. Instead of putting the die in and tightening the front bolts, then back bolt, let's do it in a zigzag pattern. Wow, that's way better. Oh, we let the bath get up to this temperature. Well, that's always, the parts are not very good when it gets that warm. Well, let's do something about that. Let's put in a little cooling radiator. Oh, okay, that helped a lot. Okay, this procedures, gauges, all this stuff, all those process variables. You start learning which ones matter and which ones don't. So after a couple months, we're quite a bit better. After a couple more months, we're making parts more like, and you can put yourself a nice distribution over that if you want. I just made X's for fun. And after a couple more months, better. And after 6 months of, and it can be a few months to get this good. It can be a few years. It could be a week. That's unusual. But I've literally worked on, I don't know, I'll just say 100 different processes. And there have been a few where we literally said, let's try to shoot for target. And they said, well, what do you mean? So, well, here's the target right in the middle. Let's see if we can make them there. And they're like, oh, okay. And then they did. It was like, well, nobody's ever asked us for that. To a couple of your points, nobody's ever asked us to make them the same, but we can. Sure, there's a little bit of variability, right? Now, this road, again, is months or years to get this good. Sometimes you have processes with a lot of built-in variability, and you got to figure out through design experiments and stuff like that, what are the process variables you need to change to narrow that variability, and use control charts to keep it in place, right?
Yeah,
So now,
definitely process experimentation will tell you whether you're improving or
yeah,
not improving your quality deliverables
yes. Okay.
quite quickly.
So if we did this, it took us a few months, several months, 6 months, whatever. We got, hey, we're way better at this. Help me out with what are the gains here? How is this better?
Well, I think you're articulating the true customer desire rather than having this silo between the supplier and the customer. You know, the goalpost approach is anything between the lines is equally fine, which is literally not true. You're pretending that it's true.
Yeah.
And now you no longer pretend that that's true. Now you're saying the truth, which is the customer really would love it right there in the middle. Let's see what we can do.
Yeah. So
happy customers, maybe like less scrap and reworking.
Yeah. So where's all the scrap, right? If you get really good at this, you don't produce almost zero. As well
Less
as
mad supervisors.
There's nothing outside of spec anymore.
We there were, I don't know, out of the 100, there were 20 different processes that we figured out. We haven't made a part out of spec for 2 years on processes that we were blowing them out all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So no scrap goes down. Again, depending. Now there's other processes it took years to make a little progress. Those are boogers, but still got there, and it was worth it. Okay, so less scrap, less rework. How about the assembly operations downstream?
They go smoother. They go more efficient.
They do. They do. Literally, we had cases where the assembly operations, they'd get these tight parts, so everybody was issued a hammer, a brass hammer. Everybody had a hammer. After a couple of years of this, didn't need the hammers anymore because parts went together so smoothly. So everything downstream runs better. It's kind of interesting. Okay, what about the burned coffee lawsuits?
Definitely saving money.
They go away. Well, they reduce.
They reduce. And
go
you're
ahead.
still gonna have that error from the person using it that might be difficult to say whose fault it was, but you didn't have to make the specs tighter in order to hit that target, which I like because we talked about that earlier.
Right. It's kind of interesting. You can get good enough to where the specs, nobody even knows what they are anymore because you don't make any out there. Now that's a really good one. That doesn't happen all the time. You know, a lot of times you're in there, but you don't have a lot of room, right? Your CP is not much over 1, so you don't have a lot of room. But other ones, you have narrow variation built in, and you just, as long as you control the location of it, you're golden. So yeah, all that. So downstream operations run more consistently. The field issues go away. As we did this, it was really interesting. When we started in one of the companies, there were a lot of field problems, complaints. And as we did this through the years, the field problems got less and less and less. Because there's some of them you'll never figure out. It's the combination of multiple dimensions. You don't even know how some of them happen. Scrap rework. We get rid of that debate over the parts are okay or not on the spec anymore. The consequences of missing, kind of interesting. If you're shooting for anywhere in target, anywhere in spec, and you miss, your consequences are scrap and rework. If you got learned how to make them a lot more around target and you miss, you're still most of the time in spec anyway. Just not quite as good, but still way better. And the last one isn't necessarily obvious to everyone, maybe, but this is also the lowest cost way to run this process through time. We didn't have any idea of that either. We thought, oh, controlling this process, keeping it in one area, that's going to be expensive. We're going to have to do more die changes and this and that and the other. It turns out you actually learn how to manage all those variables better. And it turns out to be a more efficient and effective way of running the process. And so even the operation departments, you would think it would have gone up. The cost would have gone up because we're making them in a narrower band because we've learned how to do it, not because we were forced to do it.
I would love to go back to the customer and talk him into narrowing the spec just to prevent my competitors from getting a foothold.
So that's interesting. We did have some of that conversation too, and we did take advantage of we could do some things with our part design too that we couldn't do before because there was too much variability. But once we got control and less variability, we can now move that angle up because we don't make any over the top anymore. We can move it closer to what the customer really wants. There's some interesting conversations about that too. It gives you some of and those are like unknown and unknowables going in. You could never figure out that'll help with that until you get there. So it like helps customer efficiencies, all that. It's a pretty win-win deal, but it's a commitment. It's a focus, but a good one. Total different mental model. So I don't know if you guys have thought about this at all, but you'll see this whole consistency thing around in sports too. And it's kind of like the 10,000 hours thing. You're reducing variability as you're doing so much repetition. The best field goal kickers don't practice field goals and try to get them between the uprights and say, that's good, that one's good, and that one just missed, so that one's no good. They are good and no good, but they have devices they'll put in the goalpost in the center, and they'll shoot for the center to see how consistent they can get to the center of the goalpost, so that if they miss during the game, it's probably still good. That's how some of the best field goal kickers, golfers, somebody at sports that does really well, they're often like, oh, the person's a machine, man, right? Reducing variability. It applies there. It applies a lot of different places. One other little, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. Anybody heard of the Taguchi Loss Function? I mean, this is right up.
Only from you, Bob.
Not. And this is a little bit of the guts of this conversation. This one on the left shows that, like, assuming the target is in the middle, which that's sometimes the target isn't, but assuming it's in the middle, this target is actually the lowest cost place you can make the part in terms of loss to society. Maria brought us an example of a car battery the other day, not too long ago. So car batteries are supposed to last 6 years, right? Or 5 years or whatever, right? Some of them have a good enough warranty that if they last a little less than that, you can go get some money back, but most people don't. But it's supposed to last 6 years, and it only lasted 5 years. You got shorted a year because of the manufacturing variability. Who pays for that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're putting out non-optimal product. It's supposed to last longer, it didn't, or broke earlier than it should have. But I didn't.
I'm paying for it.
I'm gonna still buy another one. Probably it's not that big, but really, I got a year less. Yeah, so that is a cost to the customer, to society. Overall, society's paying for this, and this loss function says the further you stray from target, this parabola here that's the cost to society. It goes up this way and it goes up that way, and you can actually do some fun stuff like calculate it. You can put in your mean and your standard deviation, and you can put in the scrap cost here, and you can actually calculate the area under the curve where it intersects and figure out, oh, we're losing 2 cents a piece to society right here. So you can see as you reduce variability, your costs get less. And then the worst case is if you got a process that has a nice tight spread, but you're not running it on on target, you're running it over near a spec, you're losing a lot that you don't need to be. I see a hand, Amanda.
Yeah, I had a question, not necessarily to the Taguchi Loss function, but when we're thinking about this in terms of non-manufacturing, like let's look at a call center or decisions needing to be made, or one of the issues that we have is people managing to the average, right? And so I know that there's a significant difference between saying like this is the average versus this is the target. But do you see any issue, like, do you see similar challenges in terms of, executing this, I guess, one, in non-manufacturing environments, but two, not mistaking this for that average, or not forgetting the specification limits still, right? That this is somewhere we're going. It's not necessarily something that, are we penalizing people? Is this a negative thing if they go over that number?
Yeah. You still have, even if it's a non-manufacturing area, you still have part of the idea as you gain process control and figure out how to keep it in one area, it's your inputs of your process that you have to figure out so that you can keep it where you want to keep it. So that applies, that piece of it applies anyway. So if call times, is that call times?
Yeah, that's the example I used. Like, let's say it was call times.
You still need to figure out what are the variables that affect that. And then I'm not sure about the whole target part, like what is shorter better?
Yeah.
Better. So quicker is better. So we want to reduce variability, and quicker and shorter is better. So let's figure out the variables that affect that. Same general concept. Certainly, they all have their challenges. And believe me, it's easy to just talk about this and say, this is what we should do. But in an organization...
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
It's easy for us to set the target as the average, or set the target as, less than 3 minutes, or, but, like you said there, quicker is better.
So
that's almost a target on its own.
So you talked about process control, right? Also, so at the beginning, you might say the average is 3.5 minutes or whatever, and we want what we want to do is get that in a state of control first. So currently we're trying to hit 3.5, and once we get that controlled within a certain amount of variability, it's within bounds. We know it. That doesn't mean that's not your long-term target. Your long-term target can be lower, can be 3 minutes or 2.5. Right now, we're just trying to gain control and be stable somewhere. So in process control, that's not unusual at all. We're trying to run here at 12 right now, even though we know best would be 10. That's okay. We'll get there, but we got to get some stability first. Then when we know how to make it stable, then we'll shift it down to 10. I don't know if that helps. Probably. Great question. So circling back, what we went through was quality broadly is consistently meeting and exceeding customer requirements. Good design. Agreed, we don't want to ship them clear defects. Quality begins in the absence of defects. And the key to quality, consistency. And a pretty good way, pretty good statement, mantra, whatever you want to call it, to go after at our processes is reduction of variability around target. That's kind of the term we came in. That's what that means. So what are we trying to do with this process? Trying to reduce variability around that target and work on that through time so that all the things above, it just goes into all those different benefits. Other thoughts, questions? There's a lot to the how you do this.
That's where I was kind of going to go. with it.
Mhm.
So I like how there's like that barrier to entry that quality begins in the absence of defects.
Mhm.
With the constant demand that like keeps people up at night from the customer, where you know you have to ship product and you know you got in a certain quantity of raw material, and you kind of need all of that to fulfill these orders. Where have you seen that decision get made where it's like, out of 100 pieces, we have 80 good ones and we're going to ship 80 good ones, even though there's an order for 99 right now? Like, is there a line that you have to put in the sand to say, like, we're only going to send out parts that allow us to hit that benchmark so that then we can try to be more consistent? And we have to figure out how to like ship these late or make up for it with discounts or something like that for the other 20 parts that we're supposed to go out and ship out. But like, these just aren't good enough. Like, have you seen like a line get drawn somewhere?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because early on when we started into this at one of the companies, we had a lot of different dimensions we were going after. We were trying to gain process control and reduce variability across like a bunch of different dimensions. And we were making them out of spec routinely to start with, not just off target, but out of spec. And there was a period in there, an awkward period where, okay, we're trying this process control stuff, but we just made a bunch out. So we probably would have shipped these in the past, because we didn't know any better. But so are we going to ship these now or not? And it was interesting where there's some product lines that kind of were still letting that stuff go, but a couple of them kind of said, nope, this ends now. Okay. We're going to bite the bullet right now because we believe we know enough. We're going to get better quickly, and sending those other 19 out, that's going to bite us. We know it. So we're gonna bite that. And those lines that kind of sent that message, they progressed a lot faster.
But
now it's still a business decision.
Correct. I guess building on top of that, was it a emotional decision or was it a financial decision? Because you're showing that loss function. Like, are you showing somebody in a boardroom like you're losing 10 cents a piece every single time? Or is it more like, can you continue to deal with this? Like, it's like wife swap. Like you have to change. Is it like that?
I won't say we got good enough.
Is it like wife swap?
At the loss function.
That's my favorite. That's my favorite show. I love that show.
It was more emotional at the beginning for sure. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Because you had guys that run different processes and dies, and they keep it within a couple 10,000th of an inch anyway, and they're like, this is crazy. What are you talking about? And it's interesting working with those guys. We made they could do some incredible things once you got them going down. Now let's figure out what these when you sharpen the die, you do this and this. What's that effect of that? Let's run a little experiment on that. What if we did it this way? What if we put these variables in? And they had great input on how to do those experiments. And they came up with some incredible, if you know what an interaction is, they found some interactions in their processes where one variable depends on another on the output. Crazy stuff. But they figured those things out and learned them. And then they're creating variability so tiny, they even were shocked how tiny the variability was by the time they were done. But yeah, you do have some of that awkward time up front. Hey, we're really going after quality now. Yeah, we got some out of spec here, so we're really going to not ship those. Yep. And then other lines did, and they just didn't. I mean, they survived, but they just didn't progress as quickly. It was a longer road for them because they took detours. And there was even at the beginning, some departments said, "Oh, we're doing these control charts. Don't worry, they'll be gone." The supervisor said this: "They'll be gone in a month. Don't worry."
Well, and we've probably all heard some version of that before.
Supervisor was gone in a month. Yes. It's a true story. There was a little bit of that. It's like we kind of talked about that one inflection point there, like, oh, this is a different mental model, shooting for a target instead of a spec. That it takes a while to get everybody over that hurdle, like anything, change management. But in one of the companies I was involved with in this, it was an enormous success, like save the company success level. even the president, when he retired, he said that was the best thing we'd ever done. And it went into with quality function deployment, figuring out what the customer really wants, where we have gaps. And this just fit into it super well because we could do things we didn't know we could do. And so it came up with some really, we literally had focus groups of our customers saying, the best thing you could do is just make it more consistent because I do not know what I'm going to buy. Every time I buy it, I don't know that one worked great. That one didn't work so good. That one worked terrible. The next one I bought, God, the best thing you could do is increase your quality control and make it the same one after another. Literally saying that in these focus groups. So that was probably one of the things that helped us get over the hump was that is so powerful when your customer is telling you that. Yeah.
So Bob, about this time we kind of shift over to just regular old networking. And I wanted to share like a takeaway from me or like what my takeaway is from today, and thank you, and see if anyone else has anything that they want to share. So for me, I think that I'll say my biggest takeaway was the cost to society piece of the Taguchi Loss Function. Because I think we often think cost to the company, cost to the customer, something like that. But there are some costs that come from those in spec, out of spec type decisions that seem to be ingrained in many of our company cultures. Anyone else have something to share?
I
guess
go ahead, Amanda. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking more about this idea of changing that vision or objective to rather saying, because often we'll say kind of those specification limits or those goalposts, but the difference in saying what the target is. So for me, that's just something I'm going to continue to mull over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for me, what's key about that is when people first see that, though, I can't make them all there. Well, I know you can't, but let's study that and let's get good at it. And through time, we'll get better and better and better at it.
I think one of the things that, sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
There's just a piece in there too that I think there is an assumption there that your process is relatively in control, right? As we look at this, so
yeah, so that'll create different paths
performing between the specs.
Like, yeah, if you have a narrow enough amount of variability built into your process to where it can fit in there, then it's a matter of controlling the location, which is yay.
Yeah.
But if you got so much variability, I can't even fit it all in there, even if I control the location. That's a longer road because you have to change something.
Yeah, that's a different
process. Yeah. So the X's I made are nice. That's the nice case where you got narrow variability built in, and it's not that hard to control where it's going. It's just let's start trying to control it. Yeah, absolutely. And there's other ones where we started out on some of them where the specs were this wide and our built-in variability to the process was like this wide. It's like,
yeah.
Well, yeah. What now? Because you make 10 in a row and you can't make them all in there. Yeah. So that's
go ahead, Neil. Oh, sorry, Bob.
No, it's good.
I was just thinking the challenge that most of us have is that we don't ever go and talk to the customer and ask them what their target is. So yes, you gave me a spec, but what's the true target? Do you have an exact measurement that would be ideal? And if you can elicit that from the customer, then you have the target to go after, and the team can all work together to achieve that target as opposed to getting the goalpost, the spec. So I think it's about having those conversations and enabling them either by the customer coming to the place where it's manufactured and communicating what they're looking for, or you going to the customer and understanding how they're using it and what their target is.
Yeah.
So one way or the other.
That's a good point.
If you do that, you're going to enable the team to be better at performing to target and they'll get the image of why it's important.
Yeah.
As well.
Great point. we did have some processes where we got really consistent at it, but on the wrong target. So
Yeah.
good news.
That always sucks.
Yeah, I was like, oh yeah. But the good news is we learned how to keep it in one place. So once we found out the target's actually over here, it wasn't that hard to move it. But in that meantime, it was kind of a little awkward. Like
We delivered a lot of
Yeah.
parts that weren't
it's
fit.
just consistent, but not great.
Yeah.
You know, they're still okay, but they weren't great. They could have been amazing, and they were after that. But great point.
Mine's quick. I
for
really,
it.
really liked recognizing that we're wasting a lot of time and money about which parts toe the line of either the upper or lower
Mhm.
control limit. Because that's like a whole W-2 salary job. Get the ferro arm, touch a couple points. Yep, this is in spec, this is out of spec. But there's so much variability within that wider band. That is such a great point that really kind of lit the light bulb for me.
Good. Yeah, now you see those two you argue about, and they're both a long ways from target. Now it's even more silly, right? We're arguing about those two. And they're both very low quality. Yet in our minds, we're like, that one's great and that one's terrible.
Well, yeah, and that's the ties back into that cost to society, right?
Yep.
We're paying
Yeah,
people
those-
to make that on the line decision. And to Neil's point too, we often ask for like customer feedback after the fact, and we go, was it good or bad? Or, how good was it? But we don't necessarily ask what was
What?
the target from the beginning.
What do you want?
Yeah.
Mhm.